G'day everyone, I'm Ebony Bennett. I'm Deputy Director at the Australia Institute, and welcome to Pole Position, which we do every fortnight with Guardian Australia and Essential Media on the results of the latest Guardian Essential poll. Before we start, I'd like to acknowledge that Canberra is Ngunnawal and Ngambri country and pay my respects to elders past and present, and thank the traditional owners for their custodianship of this land over many, many millennia. The days and times for our webinars do vary, so please head on over to our website at australiainstitute.org.au to register for upcoming events. We've got some more great webinars coming up, including with Cecilia Malmstrom, and who's the former EU Trade Commissioner, and Michael Brissenden, former foreign correspondent for ABC. That's coming up next week, and more great people coming up, so head on over to our website to check that out. And just a few tips before we begin to help today run smoothly. If you hover your mouse over the bottom of your Zoom screen, you should be able to see a Q&A button where you can type in questions for our panelists. And you can also upvote questions from other people and comment on their questions as well. A reminder to please keep things civil and on topic in the chat, or we'll boot you out. And lastly, a reminder that this discussion is being recorded and will be posted up on our YouTube channel within 24 hours if you have to duck out for any reason. So as I said, Pole Position is the show where we unpack the big political issues and dive into the latest polling trends from the fortnightly Guardian Essential Report. And I'm delighted to welcome back our regular panellist, Katharine Murphy, Political Editor of Guardian Australia, Pete Lewis, Executive Director at Essential Media, and John Remington from Essential as well. And I don't know about you all and how many of you are stuck in lockdown. Here in Canberra, we've gone into a snap lockdown that's just been extended. New South Wales has obviously been in one, or Sydney, for quite some time. Victoria as well, NT in a snap lockdown. And yeah, I just kind of feel like things are a bit, have a bit of an apocalyptic feel about them. At the moment, we had the IPCC report last week, which sounded a code red alarm for humanity. And this week, obviously, we've seen those desperate scenes at the airport in Kabul as that city has fallen to the Taliban and as the coalition troops have withdrawn. ABC presenter Michael Rowland tweeted yesterday, "What a mess," and he was referring to COVID. But Katharine, I kind of feel like that sentiment applies to half a dozen policy issues we're facing at the moment. Things are a bit grim, are they not?
Things are a bit grim. And hello everyone, and thanks for joining us. And hope you're all staying safe and taking care of one another in lockdown. It is really hard, and everybody reaches a tipping point, I think, with the grim news. And you've, as usual, Eb, done an excellent summary of all the things to feel horrendous about at this point in time, particularly those scenes in Kabul, which I, am still struggling to process on a human level. But as you say, we had another warning from the IPCC last week, and some nonsense erupting in the government sort of afterwards. And we've got basically these Delta outbreaks causing problems across the country at the moment. So that's definitely the sort of dominant, call of the board in terms of politics. But I guess my message to people watching on is it is really tough at the moment. And you need to pace yourselves with how much of this information you're taking in on any given day, because everybody reaches a tipping point. I had a little cry yesterday. I just felt a bit overwhelmed by the world as it is, and stood back for a couple of hours from the sort of torrent of news. And I just would recommend that people, you don't need to watch every single update. You don't. So if you need a minute, take a little step back.
Yeah, I think that's really good advice. I didn't have a cry yesterday, but I do have a cry every time I watch Ted Lasso, which is my new favorite uplifting show. But there's always some emotional thing that really gets me. So we might head into our slides. And now I've lost them. So I had them up before. Hang on. Pete, we might go to you to kick us off with while I find these slides.
Yeah.
And
Well, as you do that, because it's always the great the share screen shuffle, which is as much a part of Zoom as the you're on mute. Bouncing off Katharine, I do think I totally agree. We're in this place where I feel that there's this real risk that there's a loss in hope. And I've just put a column up on The Guardian that sort of looks at that in the context of some of these results from today. That's yesterday. That's the old one. Go back in and we'll talk. That's smooth webcasting if you've ever seen it, folks. Go to your inbox. I'm sure we've sent you the right one. Look, so I think that we are at this point where we're now really testing leadership in a different way. We've had the expectation that our authorities would deliver public health effectively. We've had expectations that our leaders would plan for the long term on the vaccine. And I think we're seeing some successes, some failures in both of those. But there's another part of leadership that I've been reflecting on, which is the role of, even in hard times, creating a sense of hope. And I think it's really hard for those leaders to get up there every day and face the reporters, which is totally the right thing to do in terms of transparency, scrutiny, accountability. But we've also got to find a space where we keep a sense of hope that we can get through this, because I suspect we're in this for quite a long haul. I think the Delta genie is now out of the bottle, and we are going to face a long process where a lot of us are going to be constrained in what we can and can't do. There's going to be a lot of financial insecurity, but also critically, there's going to be the health crisis that we're trying to avoid is going to be a reality. We cannot outrun Delta. And so every day that the leaders try to get up and say everything's under control, or this is what we need to do to get some magical reopening, is great. But the other part is, how do we create some stories and some coherence that pulls us together? One of the interesting things before we jump into the slides as well is that been reading a book that's just come out from a friend of mine, Mark Steers, who runs the Sydney Policy Lab, who looks at the way that Britain held together through World War II and the contribution of writers and artists to create that sense of British carry on, that we can do this and we'll stay the course. And you look at the importance of culture in that moment, and then the way that the government just totally threw the arts industry under the bus. At the moment where we need some alternate stories from all the gloom and doom, we've actually made it much, much harder for those people that share their creativity and build culture to help us. So that's all the premise for saying that we wanted to look at how people were feeling this week. And look, what John did, and I thought it was a really interesting way, we basically had binaries, a positive and a negative emotion, asked people to rate themselves where they were on a scale of 1 to 10. I was expecting it to be a little bit more negative than positive. And my initial thing was, we are remarkably resilient, or a large number of us are. And obviously the pandemic's affecting people in different ways. But then I also look at that red line and go, that's a quarter of the people that are really struggling on a whole lot of different levels with, the sorts of feelings that I think lead you to end up wanting to have a bit of a cry. So not so much the anger. What stands out to me here is that uncertainty and frustration. And, to that pessimistic, optimistic, 25% of us having lost hope already. And I just think there's a lot going on there that we need to start confronting as we go through this, because if we don't name these feelings, then you end up in the space where people feel forgotten and left alone. And I thought we were really good at doing this last year when it was almost a novel experience. I'm just wondering, not just from leaders, but also from each other, what we do to sort of support people over the next few months, which are going to be really hard.
Yeah.
Sorry, that was quite a rant.
That's all right. Katharine, what were your reaction seeing that.
What do you think about the biorhythms, Katharine?
Well, no. Well, I'm sort of pleased that we're tending more optimistic than not, and I think objectively there are good reasons for that. If we sort of track back to where we started with Eb's call of the board in terms of issues that are currently before us, one of the striking things about the IPCC report was was scientists foregrounding there is still time. There is still time to basically head off the most catastrophic impacts of global heating. Like, there is time. We can do it. Even though a lot of us are doing it tough in these lockdowns, and Pete's right that the Delta genie is among us, and it may be difficult, if not impossible, to drive down to what was, or use our suppression model, which was actually an elimination model by another name, right? Like we may not get back to where we were last year, but it is still incredible. Again, turning on the bright side, we have vaccinations. I mean, not enough of them, sadly, in the country at the moment, but I was reflecting on this in a recent conversation I had with Jodie McVernon of the Doherty Institute. Jodie and I spoke for the first time really at the beginning of the pandemic in 2020. And she, at that stage, neither of us had any great hope that there would be vaccinations, widely available in the timeframes where they've turned up, and yet they have turned up. So
yeah, I remember kind of right back at the beginning, people were talking about 3 or 4 years for a vaccine, and here we are.
Yeah, exactly. So it's sort of like, this is sort of not me telling, even though I started by telling people they don't need to watch every news update. I'll continue in that sort of vein by saying I think there are reasons to be hopeful, and I'm not just saying that to jolly myself along. I genuinely think there are reasons to be hopeful. But getting back to Pete's point, which is how do you manage people through a moment like this in a country or at a point in history? I think the best way to manage that is to be honest with people and not sort of not try and manage or spin issues sort of almost to breaking point. There's been a lot of talk about the thresholds that will be required for Australia to reopen again. I mean, a lot of the conversation around those thresholds hasn't acknowledged the reality in the Doherty modelling that we're going to be in a public health space, in a public health world for quite some period of time. So I think honest communication allows people to adjust their own expectations and recalibrate their own expectations, which helps people deal with their wellness, with their emotional and physical wellness.
Hey, Katharine, I wonder, one of the things that strikes me is whether the modern political kit bag is equipped for these sorts of moments. So you have the ability to manage technocratically quite complex policy. You have message discipline, but it seems to me to be able to take people on a journey of hope requires a degree of vulnerability and empathy that only it's not something that is normally rewarded in day-to-day politics. Is that too harsh?
Well, that's an interesting proposition. Is it? It's sort of a bit hard to know how it would be rewarded because it's so rarely on display. It may be rewarded a lot more than we think, Pete, if it turned up more regularly. I mean, a politician like Jacinda Ardern has crafted a prime ministership around this appearance of empathy. Yeah. Joe Biden basically presented himself as the empathetic, figure. I think that was quite compelling. I think empathy works, but I think empathy has to, what people have to be believed. The empathy purveyors have to be a credible figure. Otherwise, it's just more shtick. So, I think people are pretty over the shtick in various forms.
But if you look at Jacinda Ardern or someone like Biden, who's had extreme loss in his life, and that's kind of how he relates to people and leads with his own loss and makes himself vulnerable in that way. But That's because people know he's experienced it firsthand. I wonder too if some of that empathy might be, or the performance of it might be rejected if people aren't, if a politician or a leader wasn't backing it up with, you know, help for people, which takes me back to
but to be fair, Scott Morrison had to change football codes when he moved to Cook, so he's experienced loss.
No, done it tough.
Thank you, Peter Lewis.
Sorry, I'm a bit stir crazy in the roof.
Really interesting results. Obviously, a lot of concern amongst the younger cohorts about financial situation and mental well-being. The over 55s seem to be trucking along quite happily compared to the others. But I guess with New South Wales and the lockdown and the essential workers there, we are seeing that it is younger people who are having to go out and stay in paid work as essential workers. They're not, or overrepresented, I guess, in those casual jobs, you know, food delivery, those types of things. But yeah, Katharine, did anything else stand out to you in these results?
No, I think it's sort of, but that it sort of feels intuitively right, doesn't it? That, as you say, Ed, there's, you know, the sort of older Australians are managing better because they've got resources to manage better, but they've also got accumulated life experience, back on the resilience point, that is helpful at this point. You've got, you know, this too shall pass. You know, there's more a lived experience or a lived reality of that. But yeah, look, certainly young people are really doing it tough. And as you say, you know, a lot of young people out there in supermarkets today as we speak. And in other areas, you know, they're not able to be locked down at home. And young people, of course, are having significant trouble getting access to vaccination, which would protect them. So is it any wonder that, you know, young folks are feeling a bit existential at this point in time?
Yeah, and Pete, we were celebrating in our office. We've been doing quite a bit of work through our Centre for Future Work around getting test and isolation payments up in New South Wales, because part of the problem with people in precarious and uncertain work and casual work is they don't have paid leave. Sometimes, you know, their income is the only thing that's stopping them from being homeless or being able to eat that week. And so there was like that gap in the system that New South Wales had set up, where people perhaps weren't going to get tested because they didn't want a bad result, and then, you know, to be in a really bad way financially. That's really clear, I think.
Totally. It charts the generational financial split. We spoke about, I think, quite gratuitously on my part, baby boomers last time, and we won't repeat that. But it does show a different lived experience, doesn't it, of what we're going through at the moment. And now, particularly when this strain of the virus seems to not discriminate on the basis of age the way that the initial wave did, you know, there's real issues. The other one, of course, is parents' attitudes to what's going on with their kids, and that's also accelerating. I've got a daughter doing the HSC and a son in year 9, and I'd be, you know, obviously parents look out for their kids, but there are things going on at the moment with our kids, particularly once you get into a 2 to 3 month lockdown, which do make you worried about the long term, the opportunities they're missing out on, the engagement with learning, just the parts of life's journey that we use as a marker point. Those couple of final years of high school are really, really special, and they're not going to get that back, and that's quite disturbing. There's also up in the air in New South Wales whether the HSC is even going to go ahead at the moment. So it does speak to this broader piece on how we're all going at the moment, where I think there's a lot of fractures around the edges, and I think this is an unknown time. I'd like to think we'll get vaccinated and come out the other end, but it's going to be a bit of a journey. I
think it will be, but I thought it was really good to delve into these types of attitudinal shifts and, you know, how people are feeling at this point, particularly with a couple of those lockdowns getting extended and the New South Wales just kind of looking like it's a long way off. So you talked a bit about university and work in these questions. And exam stress and other things, and as you said, those are, it's kind of times that you can't replace for young kids.
Indeed. The school messaging's been, look, and it's really difficult from the government's perspective as well. The supply of vaccine is obviously an issue. There's a real issue even with HSC kids between those that are over the age of 18 and under the age of 18. If you're over the age of 18, you can get AstraZeneca. If you're under, you can't. There's just a whole lot of detail as well as clarity that, at least in New South Wales, we're missing at the moment, I think, when it comes to how the next few months are going to play out.
Yeah, Katharine, I'm not sure how much you know about this, but I was really deeply concerned to see those outbreaks in west of New South Wales with big Aboriginal populations that somehow still aren't vaccinated when they're supposed to be a priority population. Can you shed any more light on what's happening there?
Well, this is bad. I mean, this is really bad, sort of unfathomably so. And we've been trying to draw attention to this at Guardian Australia really for the last couple of weeks, because sort of information reached us that the vaccination rates in Indigenous populations were about half of the population as a whole, and particularly in remote Indigenous communities were supposed to be sort of first cabs off out of the rank, or whatever that expression is. And that hasn't happened. Somewhere there's been a sort of, and you can see this dynamic in New South Wales at the moment, is, you know, that the Berejiklian government is sort of besieged by problems, right? There's a very large outbreak. It's spread west, you know, through regional communities. You can see in the sort of Berejiklian government's messaging that they want to sheet home the responsibility for Indigenous populations to the Commonwealth. You know, you guys said you would do that. It's not our fault you haven't. You know, they're not washing their hands of it. That's way too strong. But there is some blame shifting language there, which is warranted. I mean, obviously, this was an area that the Commonwealth said that it would sort of, you know, crack on with. But yeah, but now is sort of you've got you know, sort of vulnerable populations basically sitting watching an incoming wave, and you've got a really difficult combination of issues in some of those communities. You've got vaccine hesitancy. You know, I gather that they've wanted to sort of bring in clinicians in order to do the vaccinations rather than health practitioners that these communities are more familiar with. It's highly problematic. And I was on Insiders, not last Sunday, but Sunday before, and used the final observation to try and get some traction around this, that we actually needed a different strategy, and quickly, because these communities were sitting ducks, and you know, and so it's come to pass. I can't explain in a granular way what's gone wrong, Eb, but the thing is, there are a combination of things that have gone wrong, and now we're in this invidious position where the tiers of government are, you know, going to want to sort of, you know, do this to try and sort of neutralise themselves from the effects. Or, you know, yeah. Anyway, it's awful. It really is.
Yeah, it will be an entirely preventable tragedy, particularly because Aboriginal community-controlled health organisations have really led the world in protecting First Nations communities from this virus. They're some of the most vulnerable, and in the early days of the pandemic, ARCHOs made sure they were having better outcomes than the general population in terms of keeping the virus at bay. And to see it potentially undone at the last minute is just kind of devastating. Yeah, so hopefully they do change up their strategy. I did hear Ken Wyatt, the minister, the other day saying that going from door to door was working, and I think Patricia Cavella saying, well, why aren't we just doing more of that if that works, you know? So yeah, anyway, but that might bring us back to the polling and uptake of vaccinations. Pete,
you know, I reckon there's a bit of positive news in here, in that we've been taking the same question over a period of time from May through to, I don't think that's August 2022, or we're really getting ahead of ourselves, but I think that's the second week of August 21, John. But you can see a drop off in the total vaccine hesitancy. That's been double figures right through the polling. It's down to single figures, 8%, which reinforces we've now got a supply problem. We don't have a desire problem, and that's a positive thing. 68% now ready to get vaccinated as soon as possible. I'll defer to John here. These are people that have either already been vaccinated or doing it as soon as possible. So that number is growing. And that's not getting far off, at least the first benchmark that has been set. And you can see that that's gone from 44 to 68 over a matter of a couple of months. So there's something going right. I guess it's lived experience and the fact that we are now confronting, and I guess the one bit of messaging that I think is coming through effectively is when people are getting really sick and going into hospital, there is the hasn't been vaccinated as part of that messaging set there. But I thought that drop off, and then the second one was actually asking people whether they would vaccinate their kids. And so again, the absolute no is, well, it's double figures. It's the lowest double figure you can come up with. But half of parents are ready to get their kids protected now. I guess then it comes down to supply and also the issues around Astra for younger people. But I think the willingness to go down the vaccine path is really obvious in these numbers.
Yeah, Katharine, and perhaps some of that hesitancy there is because they haven't really finished doing some of those trials for younger cohorts, children.
Yeah, well, it's a rational hesitancy, but I agree with Pete in terms of the general summary. That was one of the real standout slides for me in this fortnight's poll, was that we've come a positive journey there in terms of people's willingness to be vaccinated, and thank God for that.
And this next slide, I think, takes us to a debate we've been having in depth really over the last week or two, which is the idea of mandatory vaccinations and how that's dealt with in terms of workplaces and other things. So pretty strong support here for the suggestion that vaccinations should be mandatory for workers in some occupations there. And then we kind of got into an argument or a discussion, I guess, about various, should it be left up to employers to mandate these things? The unions kind of wanted to be part of that conversation and saying it shouldn't just be left up to employers, and business also asking for things like indemnity, both for if they do make vaccinations mandatory and if they don't. Where do we land on that?
I found that quite a frustrating conversation. I recognise you've got to work out the detail at some point, but it's almost like the responsibility and the rules are going ahead of an expectation that there will be compulsion or in certain workplaces. It feels a little bit like the way that the climate reform lost its way when we started putting the carburetor before the car and working out how it was going to work before we got the full buy-in that we need to actually come up with a shift. So I think it's fine that employers and unions and government works out who's to blame, but the principle that we need an expectation that workers in key industries are vaccinated seems to me to be a no-brainer.
Yeah, Katharine, do you have anything to add on that one?
No, I think it's just been a really interesting debate, and it's sort of it's been a really difficult one for Scott Morrison to navigate at a lot of different levels. Morrison is not one to sort of get preoccupied with sort of philosophy or ideological positions. And we saw, several weeks ago, probably a couple of months ago now, that the Prime Minister wanted aged care workers to be vaccinated, that be compulsory. Then, because of the way that centre-right politics is fracturing, as as we go through this crisis, you know, those sort of pressures building up on the centre right about liberty and freedom and all of that sort of stuff, that whole area of mandation or compulsion has become quite difficult for the Prime Minister to manage because of sentiment within the centre right, if that makes sense. He's got divisions in his own party about mandation and compulsion, both from, you know, the Matt Canavan end and the IPA end, if that makes sense. Sort of populists and you know, sort of more philosophical characters. So it's quite fraught. And then I think it kind of reached something of a crescendo after the last National Cabinet meeting, where the Prime Minister was addressing this point and saying, well, of course, I'm not, you know, into mandation of vaccines, except when I am, and you've seen me do that, but now I'm not so much in that space. I'm in the we are most assuredly not mandating these vaccines. And that isn't happening because of sort of practical things that Pete flagged a minute ago, which is just the nuts and bolts, right? Who needs to be vaccinated, why, how, etc. That's all happening because of the sort of political undercurrents. And so, you know, just the Prime Minister trying to manage multiple constituencies. But anyway, look.
But it comes across as I don't hold a dose, mate. It comes across that I'm looking for an opportunity to dodge my responsibility again. And he could have far better said, I will find a way to make this happen. This is the right thing. But rather he was going for the bylaws. It's not my problem. Like, you know, it's not our role. Talk to the states, talk to employers, you know, knock yourself out.
It was a pity on Friday because the sort of message that he wanted to punch home to underscore the fact that he was not in favour of mandatory vaccinations brackets, except when he is, happened to be, you know, well, we, of course, will protect employers or make sure they've got resources in the event that they choose not to mandate them, which again, right at the moment, your message surely, just in terms of your overall message frame right at the moment in the middle of this Delta outbreak, needs to be get vaccinated, I would have thought. Like that just needs to be the singular message. And because of these political cross currents, the Prime Minister felt it necessary to signal to a different constituency. Anyway, it's just the moral of the story is the longer a crisis goes on, the more complicated it gets in terms of having to manage it through, you know, various constituencies.
Yeah, and we'll go very soon to questions from the audience, but I did just want to quickly come through a couple of these IPCC slides. So Katharine has obviously extensively covered the coronavirus in Australia. Oh, that's my cat jumping to the top. We can see here, obviously, we've had the 6th IPCC report. It was reasonably alarming, as they tend to be, but also much more, I think, definitive than previous ones in saying, you know, it's definitely happening. We can attribute this, you know, and I guess we can see some of that concern reflected here in the impacts that are already with us, which was also a big part of the IPCC, Katharine.
Right. There's a burning platform.
Yeah.
There's a burning platform there. And to Katharine's point, it's the same dynamics, isn't it? The Prime Minister's stuck between his libertarian nutbag fringe who don't want any form of action and some of the more reality anchored moderates who think it's well past time for acting. And I thought Katharine Mack-Keane's intervention today was quite remarkable.
Oh God, what's he done today? I only saw the yesterday thing.
No, he's just basically saying if you want climate action in this country, you've got to signal it at the ballot box, which is could not have expressed that better myself, really. Yes, if you're worried about these things, you know, you do need to sort of reward candidates who will, you know, who will try and do something about them. But again, on the hope side, and I'm not just saying this because I mentioned that I had a small crying episode yesterday. I'm saying this because I actually mean it. The interesting thing too about just sort of referencing Pete's point a minute ago about Morrison being caught between various constituencies on the pandemic and also on climate. That's absolutely true. But it is reassuring to me that despite the Nats going nuts, as it were, the Prime Minister is continuing quite obviously to try and thread a needle here. Now, where he lands, I'm not sure where he's going to land. I'm not sure whether anybody will be happy with where he lands, because it's very difficult to see a set of circumstances where the government had an epiphany on the scale that it really needs to have an epiphany on. It's quite difficult to see that happening, but it has been reassuring to me that the Prime Minister hasn't sort of run a mile from trying to have something to say at the COP in Glasgow that won't involve all of our major allies yelling at us. Now, I don't know where this story ends, but Morrison's still trying to thread the needle, so be grateful for small mercies, I guess.
Yeah, John, I was going to ask you on this one. Overall, we can see, if you look at those national figures on the left-hand side, quite decent support for a range of kind of climate policies there. And even if you look at that middle one where the coalition is, that's still above 50% support for things like setting a nationwide net zero carbon emissions target and plan for the closure of all fossil fuel burning power stations by 2030. Like, there's some pretty ambitious stuff in there that's quite well supported.
Yeah, I mean, I think if you look at the parties themselves, that you wouldn't be too surprised that the Greens are, high up in the 80s, but it just goes to show, even amongst coalition voters or those who say they intend to vote for the coalition next time, majority of them are in support of something happening. We've highlighted just the net zero by 2030 scores in there again, because from most commentators' point of view, that's the key first step that we do need to take. That will give confidence to industries and governments, etc. And the majority of voters are in favour of that. So there's certainly a message that the coalition should be heeding.
Yeah,
I'm assuming there's a bit of an age difference on that one too. Sorry to put you on the spot, John.
Yeah, there always are with these things. More so amongst some of the biggest to the right. So there's a bit more hesitancy amongst older people, things like phasing out electric cars and fuel burning power stations.
Yeah. That's pretty normal for that type of polling, but I think that takes us back again, Katharine, to the idea of hope. There is hope, and there is time to do something about it.
Well, I think that was clear in the, as you said, the IPCC report. It removed, well, not that there was much ambiguity, but removed some of the remaining ambiguity about the causes of global warming, but also, yes, scientists emphasising that there is an opportunity here still to take action that will mitigate the worst effects. As I said a minute ago, the Prime Minister's still there trying to do something, God knows what, but we'll see it. And also, just as a marker of that, on the day the IPCC report was released, the Prime Minister put a lot of thought into how the government would message that. Now, that doesn't mean, that we should all open the champagne because these guys are about to do what the country needs. I don't think that will happen. But it wasn't like the Prime Minister came out, tried to laugh it off, tried to minimise it, tried to say it wasn't a thing. None of those things happened. So, and that reflects the sort of bedrock of community support that's being picked up in that poll. But then we do have the conundrum of people saying they want climate action and not voting for it. So go figure.
What did you make of the change of emphasis from Murdoch press as well on the IPCC?
Well, I think that's been that's not just to do with the IPCC. I think we've been seeing a change in tone actually incrementally over the last several months. I haven't done a proper literature review because I've got a day job which involves me actually just generating my own news. But I think if we went and looked at it over the past 6 months or so, we would see a tonal shift in many of those publications, which is really interesting. Somebody should look at that.
Somebody should indeed.
Volunteers from the crowd, they can come back and report next poll position.
And I can say that if you want to listen to the Australia Institute's podcast, Follow the Money, we've got a couple of episodes. I think the most recent one dealt with the IPCC report, and we've got a couple of videos unpacking some of the results there as well. And I will just point people to, if you want to go back and you're interested a bit more in how Aboriginal community controlled health organisations have dealt with the pandemic, we did a really amazing webinar with a range of different Aboriginal health professionals. I think it was about April or May last year, on how they've been dealing with the pandemic and were leading the world at that point in time, and probably still are. I'll go now to questions from the audience. Katharine, this one might be for you. It's from Dennis Walls. What can Australia do to help the people of Afghanistan?
Oh God, Dennis. Yes. What can we do? Well, we can hope that our government assists with repatriating people quickly and seriously addressing refugee claims. I have no words for what's happening at the moment in Kabul and in Afghanistan. I cannot even form words to say what's happening and how diabolical and terrible that is. So hopefully, the Taliban actually arriving in Kabul, and hopefully that may trigger action that really should have taken place several weeks ago. But I think the government actually really has to get serious about looking at the reality of the situation there, and of perhaps extending our humanity and generosity beyond saying highly qualified things like nobody on a temporary visa in Australia at the moment who is from Afghanistan will be sent back, brackets probably. I mean, we have to do better than that.
Yeah. I mean, Canada, for example, I think has opened up its humanitarian visa program to accept 20,000 people from Afghanistan. That's certainly something it's not beyond our capabilities of doing. But that's a great question. So thank you for that one. The next one I was going to ask is from Rose Reed, and touches a little, I think, on that concern about income and job support. What measures need to happen on income, rents and other supports to help people survive at this point in time? Katharine, did you want to kick off on that one too?
Sure. Well, look, the government sort of had a moderate fantasy that with the end of JobKeeper, that was kind of it, and they could start to sort of exit the fiscal implications of the crisis. I think there's been an awareness that's been obvious over the past month or so that that's not the case, that support needs to continue to go out the door to assist people who are in lockdowns, because of government mandate. In essence, this is a manufactured recession in every sense. It is governments shutting down industries to protect lives, and so in those, it's not a comet that's dropped out of the sky. It's a deliberate decision by Australian governments, the correct one, obviously, in my view, but nonetheless, it is a very odd economic slowdown because it's not triggered by an external event. It's triggered by the decisions of government. So look, there are some payments going out the door again, and I think the longer this goes on, the more pressure there will be for some of the supports that we saw in the first wave of the pandemic to return, rather than sort of, it feels a bit piecemeal to me at the moment, what's sort of happening and what's going out the door. And also, it takes a minute for people to get their heads around what's available too. I've got mates with small businesses who have been, texting me, in the ACT lockdown, do I know what's happening? Do I know what, it's sort of like, look, the government, the critical thing is that the government's got to understand that if we want to avoid a double dip recession, and that looks pretty hard on current indications, that support's going to have to go out the door, and in an order of magnitude that allows people to both survive and, importantly, conform with lockdowns and other strictures which suppresses new infections.
And you know what was really interesting about last year was that JobKeeper and JobSeeker were not just successful economically, they were successful politically. People liked the idea that government was investing behind them. And then we got through the year and the economy was looking really strong. Government's got to own this around jobs. And I think that the days over the next, or the foreseeable future, you can no more let the market just rip as you can let the virus just rip. You need to have government in place. And I think we're going to be opening the way for big opportunities for opposition parties who want to harness a bit of hope, perhaps maybe, deal with the fact particularly that we're going to have limitations on borders for a while. And so to rethink how our economy works and how we can train our people to do jobs that we used to just buy in the help. So do we have a world where we're looking at TAFE, we're looking at industry design, we're looking at a much more of a planned economy over the next decade, I reckon, than we've seen in the past. And all of that will be anathema to the coalition side of politics. But gee whiz, it's sort of a good agenda for a Labor government if they can find a way to get back into power.
Yeah, Pete, particularly too, because we've already kind of touched on employers playing a big role through all of this, and the role of essential workers really rising to the top of the national consciousness. We've seen unions collaborating with business in a way that I think Australians haven't experienced in years and years. And all through it all, essential workers, it's become really clear that they're not CEOs. It's kind of cleaners and nurses and other people, not the usual suspects. And then, behind all of that, government coming in to support people, doubling the job seeker payment, providing that supplement for a period, really as one of the biggest poverty measures that we've ever, anti-poverty measures that we've seen in Australia in many years. And then they kind of got rid of it much too
great for small business as well, because all that money goes straight back into the economy. It's not going into a share portfolio to wait for a rainy day.
Yeah, Richard Dennis, our chief economist, kind of talks about that all the time, being a really great fiscal policy as well. The next question that I've got here is from Anthony Fletcher. He says, Pete, do you have a time series on these emotional state feelings? Are we feeling worse over time or better?
Well, we do now. That's the first one. So that's a new question. But John, I think that's something we're checking quarterly from now on. I think it's a good marker. Obviously, you get much more out of these when you can compare it over time. So, yeah.
Yeah, we do have some results as well. I posted the link to our website earlier, which people can check on. There's a lot more results in there. We do have some measures from earlier in the pandemic to do with people's concern about their personal relationships, and there looks to be there's a slightly higher concern than there was, I think it was earlier in the year, for that. But generally, and as Pete mentioned at the start, a lot of the other measures we're looking at, there seems to be some resilience there at least. So people are managing to get by at the minute, but we will be checking in on that.
Thank you. The next question might be for you again, Katharine. It's from Ian Jackson. Can we conclude that the Nationals' main preoccupation is to stay in power rather than the public good?
I'm amazed anyone can sort of find a central preoccupation. I mean, well done you. It all appears a bit sort of like chaos theory to me at this point in time. Look, no, it's a serious question and it warrants a serious response. I think there is an issue with the Nats that they haven't really worked out what they're about in a sort of substantial way for quite a period of time. We've sort of, seen the party kind of transition from being a party of agriculturalists into being a party for the resources sector, sort of recognising regional employment and so on. But there hasn't really been any structure around that that iteration, if that makes sense. And now we're seeing quite significant fractures emerging in the public domain between nationals. We saw that yesterday. Matt Canavan tweeted something stupid that I won't repeat, and Darren Chester and Michael McCormack and others said, well, we don't want a bar of that sort of nonsense. And that sort of points to some fairly significant divisions within the National Party about what the various protagonists think the National Party needs to be about at this point in time. And most political parties do that work either sort of by design or by accident. I haven't really seen the Nats kind of, seriously sort of engaged in some sort of internal reckoning or thinking about what the National Party is in, at this moment in history. So if you can work them out, mate, good luck.
There's quite a profound contradiction at the heart of at least the Joyce Nationals, in that he's basically a party of protest while being the second most powerful person in the country. And I think it's that reconciling protest with responsibility and then accountability. And that's where I think they end up screaming themselves hoarse, because they're serving a role in trying to create an internal opposition within the government, but they are also the government, and they don't own that, and they are vulnerable, I think, at the moment.
Yeah, it was quite something to watch Barnaby Joyce demand the menu for...
Who's doing the work? You!
Oh, God.
The next question that I've got here is from Kevin Maguire. He says, recent federal government actions or lack thereof seem to indicate that Mr. Morrison is not up to the job. Is this only my imagination, or do guests have anything constructive to add here? Pete, I thought we might go back to the slides here for what people... And now I've lost it again. But if you want to kick off on that, I'll find these slides again. Now that they've...
Look, I made a comment earlier that I think that the challenges in front of us stretch the modern politician's kit bag. I think Morrison is particularly vulnerable. Like, what he is very good at is distilling and iterating a message and floating across the day-to-day of politics, so that if you are not deeply engaged with politics, it looks like he's playing a role that feels a bit like a leader. The problem is, at the moment, two things. One is people are engaged in politics and they've got skin in the game, and he's, I think, increasingly being exposed as someone that isn't prepared to take the responsibility that the office requires, but secondly, still trying to get away with it with his zingers and cheap lines, which then come back and haunt him. So he'll iterate and nail a message like, it's not a race, and then that becomes his epitaph when it clearly is. So in a way, every leader's strength becomes their weakness, and I think his strength in simplifying everything down to its raw essence is now the petard we hoist him on. I don't know if that works, but you know what I'm saying.
Katharine, I can see here that the number of people who think that the federal government's response to the COVID-19 outbreak is very good is dropping to dire levels here. That's just quite obvious, I guess, but yeah, that is leadership.
Well, it's the sort of principal stuff up this year, because they were actually, like the story last year was a competence story broadly, and they were rewarded for it. The story this year has been different, and the principal failing has been the vaccination rollout, and people understand that the failure to procure sufficient supply at the right time has rendered the population vulnerable, and people, that's a cut-through point that everybody can relate to because of their lived experience. And so that's the sort of well, I won't say bushfire, but that's the problem at the moment. They're caught between, a constituency of people who support the public health response and think they've buggered it up. So people who want a vaccine and can't get it, or want their kids to be vaccinated and can't get it, or whatever else, or so there's that constituency who are angry, and there's also the other constituency, which is a sort of rusted on centre-right conspiracy. I'm rushing to my punchline there. Constituency that thinks that COVID is a conspiracy, and these restrictions are sort of, international socialism or whatever they are, right? So that's the kind of, that's the really difficult position that they're in at the moment, is they're sort of copying it every which way, and mainly it relates to the vaccines. The question that we can't answer is if all of the vaccine supply hits the country at the time, over the next couple of months, basically everybody gets vaccinated, Delta recedes slightly, the economy comes back, whether the voters of Australia will forgive the government for this period. It feels a bit visceral to me. It feels the instinctive answer to that is I doubt it, but Scott Morrison controls the election timing. That's his greatest advantage as an incumbent. And look, I can't predict 5 minutes hence, let alone 5 months hence. So we're just going to have to wait and see on that front.
There's just going to be a long-term tail, though, from these failures. And I think he's going to really struggle just to say, okay, we're back where we want to be. That slide before it jumped up, that drop in approval of the government performance in New South Wales, that's dropped from 70 to 34 over 6 months. And New South Wales was going to be their fortress and their path to another term, Katharine. I think that's really under doubt now.
Oh, yeah. New South Wales is a huge problem for the government. Politically and practically,
well,
good times.
Probably going to have to wrap that there. Thanks so much for joining us, everyone. We really appreciate you. We've got nearly 1,000 people on the line with us today, so I'm sure a great many of you are locked down, as are we all here, in what has been the blissful Canberra bubble until a week ago. But we do appreciate you joining us today. We hope that you're all staying safe and at home wherever you are. And thanks for your great questions. I'm really sorry, as always, that we can't get to all of them, but we had quite a bit of number of topics to cover this week, so we appreciate you coming on that journey with us. As I mentioned, you can find all our upcoming webinars on our website, and you can register for those. Coming up next, we'll be talking to Michael Brissenden and Cecilia Malmstrom about a green recovery versus a gas-fired recovery. You can find recordings of our past webinars, including poll positions like this one, which occur fortnightly, all up on our YouTube channel. Last week, we spoke to sexual assault activist Chanel Contos about understanding consent and all the work that she's doing in that area. It was a really great chat. I encourage you to check that out. And don't forget to subscribe to our podcast, Follow the Money. You can find that wherever you normally listen to podcasts. Thanks to our regular guests, Katharine Murphy, Pete Lewis, and John Remington. Particularly when times are so hectic at the moment. Katharine, appreciate your time especially. I'm sure it's hard to find time between all the state premier press conferences and the Prime Minister every day. And want to thank you all again for coming along. Stay safe out there, get a vaccine as soon as you can, and hopefully we'll see you in a fortnight, if not next week.
Take care, everyone.
The bottom 20% get nothing. They're really unfair tax cuts.
People want to see much stronger action from the government when it comes to climate change.
It's no coincidence that we have a wages crisis in Australia.
Transitioning to net zero emissions, it doesn't seem like there's much room for gas.